If one looks over the titles of all the presentations in this annual CRF conference, culture, of course, is a central theme, but the presentations clearly go beyond that. Maybe one could say they are all about life in Cuba today, of which, of course, culture is always a big part, but also there are presentations on education, mass media and communication, international politics, issues which affect the daily life of Cuba so strongly, the environment and its changes, and necessary changes in the way people produce in response to the world's ecological crisis, some on religion and dance, and so on, including a number on history, which is always important for understanding where Cuba is today. The title of my talk, Production in Small Countries and International Trade and Cuba's Economic Crisis, correctly indicates that this will be a talk on economics. It will, however, not be an economics talk, but rather a talk about economics. Specifically, it is a talk about the much discussed biggest economic factor in Cuba's current terrible economic situation, the blockade. And while the huge negative impact of the blockade is, of course, universally recognized by Cubans in the streets, the motivation of this presentation, in line with the nature of this conference of looking at the realities of life in Cuba and how Cubans perceive them, is its claim that, in a certain sense, to be indicated next, a large part of the population of Cuba underestimates the negative effects of the blockade. Now, if this claim is correct, an immediate issue of great importance to be researched would be why many Cubans in the street underestimate the negative effects of the blockade. This would be tremendously important to understand for maintaining support for Cuba's project of building socialism. That, however, would be a much bigger issue than this presentation will address. This presentation will, rather, only indicate the sense in which many Cubans in the street underestimate the negative effects of the blockade, make only a few comments in passing concerning why they do, and then present a simple indication of why the blockade is so harmful to Cuba. It goes beyond what most Cubans in the street, or even most supporters of Cuba abroad, understand concerning the way the blockade achieves its harmful effects, and from that, why the blockade is so harmful. It will have 4 parts. A motivation for why I am making this presentation, the basic theoretical argument on the relation of international trade to domestic production for small countries, 2 observations from the real world supporting the theoretical claim, in particular for Cuba, and a conclusion. Motivation for this presentation. In very simple terms, by far the 2 major factors in Cuba's critically bad economic performance are the blockade and errors in the economic policies of the government. I have no hard data from surveys to indicate what Cubans in the street think about the relative contribution of these 2 main factors to Cuba's current economic crisis, but I claim just from my interaction with many Cubans that many see the government's policies as the primary factor and the blockade, while important, as secondary. That is the sense in which I will talk of many people in Cuba underestimating the harm done by the blockade. I argue, contrary to this, that the blockade is the most damaging factor and the government policy errors, while very important, are secondary. In a very hand-waving way, I would argue the blockade causes maybe 2/3 to 3/4 of the damage, and government errors cause the remaining 1/4 to 1/3. In fact, the 2 types of errors are not even really fully separable, as government errors are often made because of trying to get around the blockade. But this is just a broad conceptual presentation and not some regression analysis or other mathematical model of relative contributions of the various sources of Cuba's economic problems. 3 final comments before I make the intended argument on why the blockade is necessarily massively harmful to Cuba, independent of what the Cuban government does in response. First, while I've said many Cubans in the street would place the negative effects of the government errors above those of the blockade, of course the government does consistently claim to the contrary that the blockade is the bigger effect, and so there's also many people who do accept the government position. This presentation is not concerned with the interesting and important question of which group is bigger. It is concerned, rather, only that a large number of Cubans hold the wrong position on this issue, and that group has grown significantly since the economy went into serious problems over the last 3 to 4 years. Second, opponents of the government continuously push the claim that the government always blames the bad results of all its errors on the blockade. Just looking at the government proclamations over decades shows this is false. In speech after speech, the government has acknowledged that they have made important economic errors. But in the face of an economy in crisis, many people, and again, not all people, tend to blame the bad situation on the government, since doing so often offers some hope. If one could change government policy or change the government, things could get better. If, to the contrary, they see the blockade as the main problem, then they need to accept that as long as the U.S. maintains the blockade at its current level and there's no major economic linking of the Cuban economy to a non-U.S. larger economy like Russia or China, that the economy will continue to do badly. Obviously less badly if the government made no economic errors, but still the economy would be bad. The basic theoretical argument on the relation of international trade to domestic production for small countries. The theoretical argument here is very simple. Production of many modern goods is a multi-step process, and specialization in production has led to the various steps generally being done by different independent production units. Small countries do not have big enough economies to be able to have productive units for all the different steps within their national economies. This means that they need to be able to buy internationally the necessary intermediate inputs for what they can produce to be able to produce at all. And they need to be able to sell internationally some things to produce that they produce to obtain the international currency to buy these necessary inputs. In addition, scale effects for many goods mean that to be efficient, they need to produce larger amounts of what they produce than their domestic economy can absorb. And so this also means they need to be allowed to sell internationally. So that's it for the basic theoretical argument. For a small country, autarky is not an option. For the domestic production of many goods, with domestic production being the main source of domestic consumption and employment, international trade is necessary. If international trade is blockaded, it blocks the ability of the country to domestically produce wealth and correspondingly reduces what it can consume. In part 3 of this presentation, I will make 3 real-world observations supporting the theoretical claim of point 2, and in particular for Cuba. These concern the level of trade that exists in small countries, a comment on the standard interpretation of why Cuba did well in the early 1980s, which I actually won't do for reasons of time, so there's only going to be 2 points, and data on the nature of Cuba's imports. The so-called trade openness index indicates the amount of international trade a country does compared to its production. Specifically, it adds the amount of exports to the amount of imports and divides that sum by the GDP. Look at the 2 highest of the long-standing capitalist countries in this list, Belgium and Netherlands. Since exports and imports are always about equal, we can say roughly that Belgium both exports and imports goods valued at 82% of its GDP, and for Netherlands, that's 77%. The small countries of Belgium and Netherlands generate their high per capita GDP and high material standard of living exactly as was indicated in the last part. They produce specific steps in multi-step production processes and not others, and do so on a scale far above what they can absorb domestically, thus enabling them to be highly efficient. But they can do this only because they are securely embedded in 2 larger economies, the EU economy and the world capitalist economy, from which they are assured that they can always buy the inputs they need and sell their outputs. And so also investors will invest because they will know this, and that will give them cutting-edge technology. If a blockade like that on Cuba were imposed on Belgium or Netherlands, there's nothing their governments could do to avoid collapse. I will say a word in passing on something else you might notice in this table that again supports the argument on trade and domestic production, but does so in relation to the collapse of Comecon, Came in Espanol. Notice the domination in this world list of the former East Bloc countries and some new countries coming out of the former Soviet Union. These are the countries that the world capitalist economy has decided to incorporate into it in a particular way. Basically, much of their technology was behind that of the West. To make them viable parts of the developed capitalist world economy, they need to produce at the efficiency levels of the world economy, adjusted for their cheaper labor cost. So investment into these countries is into this or that step in the production chains, in some cases into areas that were not so far behind the West on average, and abandoning the rest of the economy. Hence, they need to buy internationally lots of intermediate inputs to produce, and hence these countries show up as having very large weights of international trade in their economies, again, of productive intermediate goods. Let's look at Cuba. Compared to those leading countries in the last slide, it's a disaster. Imports and exports are about 13% as opposed to over 75%. As a small country, Cuba cannot achieve the level of domestic production of small European countries unless it vastly expands its trade. This slide also shows something about imperialism in regards to this issue of international trade and production. What we see is that the average for Latin America and the Caribbean is only 24%. We all know that the global south is exploited by trade in raw materials, but despite this, we see how low its trade index is. This is exactly the issue of being integrated into world production chains. Notwithstanding the so-called trade from having their raw materials ripped off, their total trade is low compared to the developed countries exactly because they are not thoroughly integrated into world production chains. A final quick note. There's not a simple linear tight link between total trade and total GDP, but rather it depends upon the nature of the trade. If it's just a huge selling of some raw materials, but not a thorough integration into world production chains beyond that, it will remain very poor, like Jamaica. And the Dominican Republic has more trade than Uruguay, but Uruguay has by far the highest per capita GDP in Latin America, and that is because it is integrated into international chains of production in pharmaceuticals and some other fields more than any other country in Latin America, and not from selling beef. The data in this third supporting point provides very strong support for my argument, and it can be presented very quickly. Looking at 2018 before COVID, but more importantly, before the vastly escalated Trump blockade measures came into effect, 80% of Cuba's imports were for production. 2/3 of imports were intermediate goods, and an additional 14% were capital goods, investing in Cuba's future. Only 20% were consumption goods. This graph shows something else interesting about this issue of imports for domestic production and consumption. Looking at 2022, after the COVID shocks, and even more importantly, when the Trump-Biden blockade measures were almost all effective, because new measures quite often take 2 to 3 years to become fully effective, we see the imports for production stayed about the same 66%. In the face of the need to try to help the population, the government cut capital spending, hence harming Cuba's future, almost 50% in order to boost imports for consumption by nearly 33%. But the point is just what I have argued. To produce domestically, one needs to import intermediate goods. That could not be changed. In the face of the increased blockade, Cuba's total output fell, and that involves stopping some production that Cuba is capable of, but this just shrinks everything. It does not allow a change in the percentage of intermediate goods imported, because that is what Cuba, as a small country, needs in order to be able to produce domestically. To conclude rapidly, a summary and then 3 short notes of hope in a picture of unavoidable bad economic performance as long as the blockade remains. Summary. There's a misconception that the blockade hurts consumption by preventing access to consumer goods that are not produced domestically. It does do that, but that is by far the smaller part of its harm. For small countries to produce goods for their own consumption, they need to be able to buy productive inputs or intermediate goods, and they need to be able to sell their outputs internationally to pay for those necessary productive inputs. While blockades have some negative effects on any country, the effect is much less on large and especially continental-sized economies, like, for example, Russia, since large parts of the productive chains of many of their goods are entirely in their own country. For a small country, the biggest effect of a blockade is that it causes domestic productive capacity which exists to not be able to be used. In this sense, it is appropriate to argue that the major effect of a blockade on a small country is analogous to bombing the country's productive facilities, notwithstanding the lack of the visible violence so obvious in bombing. In this sense, and not making the incorrect claim that a blockade is fully equivalent to military aggression, it is correct to call such blockades acts of war, as was well argued and well supported in the 2021 book edited by Stuart David and Emmanuel Ness, Sanctions as War, whose excellent chapter on Cuba was written by a participant in this conference, Helen Yaffe. 3 very short notes of hope to end. One, the amount of production and the technical sophistication of its production by parts of the global south continues to expand. Of course, China's new role in the world is by far the biggest of such effects, but this goes to a lesser extent for many other countries in the global south as well. Some of these countries are very concerned with the large US market, and so they are not candidates for trade with Cuba. But a growing number of companies in the global south target the rest of the global south with some of their products, and so they are not closed off to trade with Cuba by the blockade. Two, the existence of BRICS is related to the last point, but there is one special additional point concerning BRICS regarding this that is very important. Given the lack of unity of the economies of BRICS, there's no possibility or even the desire on their part to offer an alternative BRICS currency to the dollar as a world currency. What there is, however, and of almost as much importance to Cuba, is the intention to develop payment systems not dependent on the dollar and hence which are not subject to US control. This will unfortunately not appear in a year or two, but might develop soon. But it might also not develop soon. We will see. Three, and finally, most likely if Harris wins the US elections, the blockade will remain largely unchanged for at least her first term, but conceivably could be reduced to the Obama level or further if she has a second term. If Trump wins, it has been made known that still further blockade measures will be implemented, all designed by Rubio, as were the Trump measures themselves. Trump will again outsource his whole Cuba policy to Rubio if he wins. The good news is what could not have been imagined a couple of months ago. It now looks like there is a good chance that Harris will win, though the election is definitely not determined, which would allow the blockade to remain at its unacceptable, terrible level, as opposed to becoming significantly worse. Thank you.